Hey everyone, April Dunnam here. In today's video, we're going to talk all about PowerApps Components. We'll talk about what components are, why you might want to use them, go over some use cases, and we'll walk through creating a component. All that coming up right after this. So what exactly is a component? At its simplest level, it's just a reusable control. So when you go into PowerApps and you click the Insert button, we see all of the different controls that we have out of the box. Everything from labels and buttons, to various text input controls, drop-downs, rating controls, pin inputs, you name it. Oftentimes we're using a variety of these controls together to create something. For example, a header on your screens might consist of a label control, like I have here. You might also insert a rectangle icon so that you can have some kind of background or shading effect. And you might have different icons so that you can click between screens. So we might add an add button and situate that on the screen. And then when we click on that, have that open up a different screen where we can add a new item. And we might use the home icon so that we can always return back to our landing page. A simple header like this is something that we would need to use in multiple screens in our applications, as well as multiple different Power Apps that we create. This is a very simple example of a header. So this header has 4 different objects right now. We have 2 icons, a label, and a rectangle control. If I want to have this same header in all of my other screens, I have to copy all these controls and paste them on every screen that I want to use them in. There are many reasons why this isn't ideal. For one, if I have to make a change to this, maybe I don't want this background color of the header to be purple. Maybe I want this to be blue. Now I only have 2 screens right now, but imagine if I have an application that has 30 or more screens. If I need to make that change, that means I'm going to have to go into each one of those different screens, click on that rectangle, and change the color. Now we can do it, but it's really tedious and time consuming. This also opens you up to have inconsistencies in your applications. If you have a lot of screens, you can easily forget to update the width or the height or the color or the text or the icon, whatever it might be that you have in that header on one screen versus the other. And one of the important things to have a well-designed application is to have consistency between your screens. Also, this header has 4 different controls in it right now. We just copied those 4 controls onto another screen. So now our application is up to 8 controls. So if we need to copy this same header across 30 different screens in our app, that means that we've added 120 different controls just for a simple, consistent header across our application. One of the things we know about PowerApps performance is that the less controls you have in your application, the better. Fortunately, there's a better way to handle this, and that's where components come in. So for this same header control, I could create this as a component instead. And what this is going to do is give me the ability to create it once and use that in multiple different screens and multiple Power Apps. And I'll have one source of truth where I go to make any edits, and those edits automatically get pushed down everywhere that I'm utilizing that control. It's what we call in technical terms a parent-child relationship. So if I wanted to redo this header as a component, I can open up my Power App and click on the Components tab in the tree view. And you'll see an option here for New Component. So we can actually create these components within your Power App itself. We can also import components from other applications, which we'll get into here in a bit. But let's click on this New Component button and let's see what the process looks like to create a new component. So you'll notice as soon as I clicked that, a new option here in the tree view showed up under the Components tab called Component 1. This is the placeholder for me to build out my brand new component to use. When you do this and create the component, it automatically adds an object here with a standard width. So right now you'll see on the right-hand panel here that this size is set to 640 by 640, but we can control how wide and how tall this particular component should be. Now, since this is for a header, I want this to take up the entire width of my screen. So I'll change that to 1366, and let's change the height to, let's do about 100. Now that's about the height and width that we would want for a header. Now, since I've already built out the header like I wanted, what I'll actually do is go back to my screen. I'll click and hold down Control to copy all of these objects, and I'll click the 3 dots and copy. So we can actually just paste that right here into our component by clicking the 3 dots and paste. And now all of those objects are here in my component layer. Now, of course, there's much more to it that we can configure with these components. The first thing I probably want to do here is give this component a meaningful name. So I'm going to click the three dots next to it where it says component 1. We're going to select the rename option. I'll just call this my header. Okay, so next, for this header, we probably need to dynamically change the text that shows. So if we go back to our screens, on the home page, I probably want the text to say landing. But on the functions page, I want it to say intro to components. Now we know if we were doing this the old school way of just copying and pasting the objects between the screens, we can just go into the individual object on that screen and update the text. But remember, we're trying to use a component which allows us to create one central location for this and use it and repeat it amongst different screens. So since we're doing it this way, we need some kind of property that we can dynamically set on the screen to change this text. And we can do this with components with the properties feature. So if I click on the my header component that we just created and look on the right-hand side in the panel, you'll see an option for custom properties. If we click new, we'll have a panel pop up, and this is where we can specify a property for this particular component. Now, what are properties? Let's go back to the Screens tab, and let's talk about what a property is first. So every object that you put inside of your PowerApps Maker canvas here has its own unique set of properties that you can define for them. So looking at this label control that I have on the screen, we can tell what kind of properties that we have for this by going to the upper left-hand corner and clicking the drop-down on this Properties panel. So for this label, I have a property to set the alignment. So I have that center aligned. We have properties for the color of the text, for the font. We even have properties where we can define actions like the onSelect property. So when we click on this, we can have it perform an action like set a value, submit to a data source. So there are all different types of properties for these different objects that we can define. And with components, we can define our own custom properties. So back here on our component, let's click on that new custom property again. And we see we need to give our property a display name, a name, and a description. So for this, I might need a property called header text. We'll do a description. Then we need to choose the property type. Input properties, meaning that we can take data and pass it in to our component. So in the context of our header, we want to dynamically set the text that shows in the header. That would be an example of an input property. We add this component onto a screen, we pass in the text that we want to show, and that feeds into our component. Then we have the opposite, which are output properties. This is where we need to get some kind of data from the component itself and output that to one of our screens. So if we had a component that had a gallery in it, maybe we need to be able to get the selected item from the gallery in that component and show that somewhere on a screen that we're in. That would be an output property. Okay, so we're going to select the input option here for our header text property. And next we need to choose the data type. So there are a few different data types that we can have for these properties. And you can see all of those here. We can have everything from text and colors and dates, numbers, booleans, even images and audio and video. So you would select the type of data that you're needing to pass in with the property. In our case, it's just going to be a text. And there are a couple other options that we can configure here. I'm going to come back to those at a later point because I want to get this property created. So we're just going to click the Create button now. And now we have a new property for our header component called header text. Now we need to do one more thing to actually wire this up. We have the property itself, but we need to tell our label control inside of our component to use that property for its value. So what we'll do is we'll click on the label control itself, and we'll change the property, and we'll go to its text property because that's what controls what text shows up. And rather than hard coding that, we'll delete what's in there, and we'll type in the name of our component, which I called my header. And if we do a dot after that, we can get all the properties for this particular component. And the first one you see that pops up is header text. It's that custom property that we just created. And if I select that, you see the text that displays here in the label instantly changes to text. And that's because if we look at the my header component and go to the header text property in the properties pane, that default value there is set to text. So if I change it to something else, you see it's updating in real time in my component. So let's keep this really simple and say this is all that we want to do right now for this header component. Now let's look at how we actually use this within our application. So we're going to click back on the Screens tab, and I've added 2 blank screens here where I want to use this header component. All we have to do to use that, now that we've saved it, is click on the Insert button, or click on the plus from the left-hand side. Either one will get you there. And then you'll see an option for Custom. This is where all the components that you have within your app will show. So we'll select the My Header component we just created, and that adds it to our screen. So you see we have a screen 1 with just one object in it, our header. And you'll see on the right-hand side when we have that header component selected in our screen, there's our header text property that we defined. And we can specify the header text to show here. So as soon as I change that and click away, it updates that on the screen. And I can do the same thing here on screen 2. And now we just have one simple control on both screens. Now remember, one of the benefits that I said here was that if we need to make a change to this, we only have to make that in one spot. Well, let me show you how that works, because now we have this header component on 2 different screens. And what if I want to change, say, the color of that background again? What do we do there? Well, we'll go back to our Components tab, and we'll click on our component there. And if we make the change at this level here, so I'll click on my label, I'll click the Fill property, and we'll click the red option instead of the blue. So it's changed here at the component level. Now if I go back to my Screens tab, you see it's automatically updated on screen 1 and screen 2. So we looked at an example of using those input properties in our components for a simple header control. Now let's take a look at where those output properties would come into play. To do that, we'll do a simple choice picker. So I'm going to go back to our Components tab. We'll click the New Component option. I'm going to rename this to Choice Picker. And for this one, let's actually insert a gallery this time. So I'll insert a vertical gallery. And when we have the gallery selected on the Items property, I'm actually just going to hard code some options. So let's see, let's do Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agents, and Power BI. I'll change this to just be the title. And now all that's left is to configure our output property. So for this, we'll want to be able to tell which option the user has selected from this gallery. So we'll click on the component, we'll go back to that properties pane on the right-hand side, and we'll say New Custom Property. We'll call this Custom Property Selected Item. We'll change that property type this time to an output property, and we'll leave it as data type text. So let's click Create. And now if we click on the Properties dropdown with our component in the upper left-hand side, we'll see that selected item property. And let's replace what's in there, and let's set that to our gallery. So gallery2.selected.value. Now we'll have that output property dynamically set the selected option from this gallery so that we can use that within our screens. That's all that we need to do for this component. So let's go back to our screens. And on screen 1, we'll insert that new component here. So we'll click on our Insert button, go to the Custom option, and there's our new Choice Picker component. So we'll click on that to add it. So what I want to have happen is when I click on one of the options here in the gallery from the Choice Picker component, I want to show the text of the item that we selected in a label. So I'm going to insert a label control, and this is where we'll use that output property. So in the text property of this label, I'm going to replace what's there with the name of our component, so Choice Picker 1. And if we do a dot, we should see our custom output property. Yep, there it is, selected item. So if I do that, that'll return that value. And I'm just going to append some text to the beginning of this. So we'll say use selected, then we'll have the selected item, and then we'll append an exclamation point at the end. All right, now if we play this, when we first run it, it is empty because we haven't selected anything yet. But as I click Power BI, you see the label value changes, and it's using that output property as I click on the different items in the gallery. So far, we've covered input and output properties and showed examples of each. Now let's segue into some newer functionality that we have available to us in components. These properties and functionality that I'm going to be showing you here is currently under experimental functionality, so you'll have to explicitly enable them inside of your application to use them. So to do that, you're going to click on the File tab, go to Settings, select Advanced Settings, scroll down here, find the Experimental Features section, and you'll enable the Enhanced Component Properties feature by toggling this to on. This is what enables us to use these behavior properties in something called user-defined functions or custom functions. Be careful using these experimental features in your production-ready applications right now, because since they are experimental, they can change at any time and potentially cause some issues. But this is really cool new functionality that I wanted to make sure to point out. Once we have that feature enabled there, we can have additional options to configure for our components. So if we look on the Components tab, you might have noticed that I had two other components. I have regex utils and date functions. And both of the components look like they don't have anything on the canvas itself. But if you look at them on the right-hand side in the properties, we have a few different custom properties defined. These are all output properties. But if we click on one of them, like the isCurrency, you see that we're using a new functionality called parameters for our components. So this is really powerful functionality that enables us to build something called custom functions or user-defined functions inside of our PowerApps. Now we've always had the ability with the PowerApps canvas language, also known as PowerFx now, to use formulas to manipulate data and do things. So here's a common use case for a formula in PowerApps, and that's data validation. Say we have an input field here where we want to put in currency and we want to validate that what we put in there is a valid currency value. We can do that with a formula that looks like this. So I've added in a label control and we're using some regex or regular expressions to validate that a particular field is a currency field. So I'm taking in the text inputs here that we have. I have my regular expression and it will return true or false to say whether this is a currency value or not. Right now it's false because I have text entered. But if I were to put in 500, that returns true. So that's PowerApps formula language at its finest, but what if I wanted to be able to extract this and use it easily in multiple different places? Wouldn't it be cool if you could curate a library per se of all of your favorite formulas that you use commonly in your PowerApps? Well, now we can with custom functions in our PowerApps components. So rather than putting this here inside the label, I can go over to my Components tab, and you see I have a regex utils component. This is actually a sample that Geetha Sivasalam created. And if we look at this particular component, although there's nothing showing on the screen, you see we have three custom properties on the right: isCurrency, isPercent, and isTime. Let's look at the isCurrency, and we're using some of that new experimental functionality here to define parameters for this property of the component. So for my isCurrency property, we have a parameter called currency text, and this is a text parameter. And we're making this required so that we have to pass in some kind of currency text to validate it so that it can run through and return us the result. And you'll see we can have multiple parameters here. So I can do new parameter and we can define those here. Now what this allows me to do, so I have my output property here. So if I go into my components, you'll see that there's our isCurrency output property. And below that, there's the parameter we specified, currency text, which I have right now set to text. And if I look at the isCurrency property itself, you'll see that's where I'm defining that formula. So we're doing the if is match, and we're actually passing in that parameter we defined, currency text, and that's what we'll do the validation off of. And this is the exact same pattern for the isPercent and isTime, just slightly different formulas. We have a parameter that we pass in, and that validates the data that we're passing in. How this can be used inside of your PowerApps, if we go back to our screens and go to my function screen, here's how this can actually work in action. So if you have a lot of different things you want to validate, maybe currency values here, percentages, time, we can add all of those on our screen. And then what we'll do is we'll add in our component that we had there. So we'll add in this regex utility, and it will just be a hidden component on the screen. Because if you recall, that was a blank component, so we just have it kind of out of the way here and the left-hand side so that we can have that on the screen to use. Let's start with the currency one. So what I've did is I've added toggle controls. So we went to Insert, Input, and Toggle. I want this to show a pass-fail or valid or invalid and have it run the custom functions that we defined within the component. So on this toggle, if we go to the Properties pane and select the default property, you'll see that we can actually call our component itself, which is called UDF regex utils, and we can do a dot and get those output properties that we defined. So I'm calling my new custom function called isCurrency, and I'm passing it in the text that I wanted to validate, which in my case is an input field called currency. So now I've just abstracted that formula. I can call it multiple places inside of my screen here, and we only had to write out that formula once within the component. And we're doing the exact same thing for percent validation. So that's a separate function. So we're calling the dot isPercent and passing it in the data that we want to have it validate, and the same for time. Now if I play the app, my currency format right now is showing invalid. because all I have is a number 5. But if I change this to $5, that switches to valid. So that just validated my text there as I typed. Same thing for percent. As soon as I remove that percentage, valid, and then invalid. And the same thing for time. So right now I'm showing this visually using these toggle controls, but we could also take advantage of this on submit. So if you just wanted to behind the scenes validate your data before submitting it, you can just call that function like we did on this toggle default, do all your checks, and if it doesn't meet any of those requirements, throw a message or an error up to the user letting them know that they need to fix the issue. And you'll notice I had another component called date functions. So I'm using several custom functions here for dates. So as you can see, we have a ton of different output properties defined for this. A common one that you'll see is start of the week. We're defining parameters for this where we can pass it in a date, and this will perform this nice long function and return back to us a yes or no if the date we pass it in falls within the start of the week. So how this works visually, same concept. I have a toggle here that's valid or invalid. So if I put in a date here, so in this date picker right now I have April 19th selected, and that is within the current month. But if I were to change this, select a date in March, that toggles to invalid. So that lets me know that that date is not within the current month. These date functions are really useful. I've ran into all kinds of scenarios and applications that I built in PowerApps where, say, we need to not let someone put a due date that is past the current date, right? So this particular function here that we're seeing will help us do that. Same concept here for current week and even current day. So I hope you're getting excited about these custom functions because I really am. And to make it even easier to get started with these custom functions, you can go to aka.ms/powerplatform-samples, and you'll find all of the samples that I just showed you today. The date functions were submitted by Matthew Devaney, and the regular expressions functions were submitted by Geetha Sivasalam. We have a brand new sample browser, so all you have to do is use the search, and if you know you want to find a percent formula, do a search for that, click on that, and we have documentation on how the function works. And if you go into the solution folder, you can actually download the MS app that contains the component with those functions in it. All right, so we're almost wrapping up here. The last thing I want to show is how we can take these components that we built and use them inside other applications. There are a couple different ways to do this. So right now I have this custom functions app and I have it saved and published into my environment here. So if I wanted to use this component with inside other applications in this particular environment, here's the easy way to do that. So we'll go back to make.powerapps.com, click the new app tab, and we'll just do a blank canvas app. And we can actually import those components in by clicking on the components tab and clicking the 3 dots next to new component. And you'll see an import components option. That'll open up a panel on the right-hand side, and it's going to show you a list of all of the different Canvas applications that you have in the current environment that you're in. And as you see, we have that custom functions app, which is the one that we had open here. So we can click on that, then click import. And as soon as we do that, you see that I actually took all the components that were inside that application and put them here into our new blank Power App so that we can use them. Now, an important thing to point out what happened there is this essentially created a copy of those components. So any changes that I make in this application to the components aren't going to affect the versions of the component that I have in the other application. This could be good or bad. There might be instances where you do need a copy of the components in a particular application so that you can make changes and make it a little bit differently. But you might want to have a true parent-child relationship where you have one place that these components are stored, and that's the one place that you go to make the changes, and everywhere that they're used is automatically updated. That's possible with something called component libraries. So if we go back to make.powerapps.com and click on the Apps tab, you might have noticed that we have an Apps tab here and a Component Libraries tab. A component library is basically an application shell, but solely intended to store components. So we can create a new component library by clicking that button. And let's create one called Custom Functions. So we'll click Create, and this will create our component library app. And we can have multiple component libraries if we want them. So you might have a component library for navigation, and you might have different navigation controls. You might have one for custom functions like we're doing. And when you're building the component library, you can import in components from other applications, just like we did earlier by clicking the 3 dots and going to Import Apps. So let me import my custom functions and all of those different components that we had in that application there. So those are all in this component library, so I'm going to click File. We'll go to save, save again, and now we're good to go. So if we go back to make.powerapps.com and refresh the page here that has our component library tab selected, we'll see a brand new component library called custom functions. This will be the one place that we go to add new custom functions and to edit the ones that we currently have. And we'll use this component library to import in those components in any application that we want to use. So let's do a new application. We'll do a Canvas app again. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky. When you're using component libraries, you don't import the components the same way. So we're not going to go to components and import and all of that. We need to click on the plus on the left-hand side here, and you'll see an option at the very bottom that says Get More Components. This is where the component library components will show up. So you see on the right-hand side, I only have one component library called Custom Functions, and it actually lists out all the different components within that component library. So one benefit that you'll see of this right off the bat is I can select and only import the functions that I care about. It's not an all or nothing like it was when we imported it the other way. You remember how in this application we clicked on components, we went to import, and we selected that application we had, and it just automatically dumped all of the different components in? Well, by doing it this way, we can pick or choose the ones that we want to add in. So maybe I only care about the header, so I'll select my header, click import, and now that's added into my app. Now, another tricky thing again that you'll notice is it's not showing here under the Components tab like the other ones we were looking at. So to add this component onto our application, we got to click the plus button again. And as soon as we imported that library component, you'll notice we have a new section called Library Components here, and that's where those components will show up. So I can add in the My Header component, and now that's there for me to use. I know that's a little confusing that there's not a consistent experience there, but the main reason I wanted to show you the component library side of things is because that is a way to create one central area where you would build the components and where you would edit them, and you can use them in multiple applications, rather than the way that we talked about earlier where you can import them in, but it's really just making a copy of that component in your application. So I hope that I've given you everything that you need to get started building components and explained why they're really useful to use. If you found this video helpful, please do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video.